Hello, everybody. Hope that you're all well. So this is just another screencast kind of update from Shane, Brian, and myself, just around where you are at with the e-learning project, the next steps, and maybe a couple of considerations based on our discussions with Yi, but also from students from previous years of the project, challenges they encountered at this stage, things that kind of maybe they weren't entirely aware of, or kind of common mistakes that kind of we might have seen coming into the prototype. So at this stage, we are looking for you to produce the second assignment for this module, which is the screencast and the accompanying presentation based on your development of a prototype of your e-learning project. So just a couple of kind of pointers around this. One is to try and make your screencast as professional as possible. So the presentation of the screencast has marks going for it as well. It's not just the prototype and the state of the prototype and kind of decisions that you've made that you get marks for. You also get marks for producing a professional, thorough screencast. So with that in mind, we would encourage you, when you're recording the screencast, to find a quiet room. It doesn't have to be completely silent. We're not looking for perfection or studio quality kind of audio, just that it is audible and visible to us. So with that in mind, I encourage you to find a quiet room to record it in. Another tip, just in terms of recording the screencast, is write down what you want to say. Avoid the temptation to write down like a entire script that you have to follow absolutely verbatim. This absolutely can and probably should be in your own words, but to help guide that process and basically to help avoid any kind of frustration, any frustration in recording the thing, having a couple of just bullet points for yourself in terms of talk about this, then talk about this, then talk about this, then talk about this, then finish. Having something like that to hand is useful. It is something of a balance. Like I said, I don't think it's a good idea to write out an entire script that you have to repeat absolutely verbatim. But equally, you don't want to go entirely off the top of the dome. And the main reason we mentioned this is just to try and avoid you the hassle of, if you're going off the top of the dome, kind of encountering difficulties, stumbling over parts, and kind of the frustration that comes along with that. And also, kind of developing a kind of a script from scratch and kind of repeating that verbatim. That can be quite time consuming as well, particularly when you're trying to match up what you're doing on screen with kind of a very specific, very kind of detailed script. So look, try and find a balance there yourselves, but I would say, some kind of structure and just talking through it is good. Maybe even try a couple of trial runs. And I would say with any kind of screencast, definitely feel free to pause and take a few breaths at any stage. If you are recording the screencast, what can be useful is if you split it up into sections. So I'm going to do the introduction section. So you record that, then you pause the screencast. You decide what you're going to talk about next. That might be kind of a quick overview of the authoring tools you use. You record that, then before moving on, you pause it, and just breaking it up in that way can make the entire process a bit easier and a bit less stressful for you, and a bit less time consuming also. Another point is that it is important to show us a prototype in action. So what we're not looking for is a bunch of source files and a description of what you've done and kind of, how this file ties into this file, ties into this file. Equally, you don't need to show every single detail of how you got to this stage. You'd be surprised how quickly the time will get used up when you are putting together your screencast. So ideally, try to focus on showing us what the or what your prototype looks like in action. So we don't need to see, for example, the source file and kind of the breakdown of that. More the thing in action. Now we understand it's not going to have every single functionality in every single section, but ideally it would be great to see what, almost like a bit of a preview of what the end user will see. So your prototype should try to do that. It should try to identify what the user experience will be, and as you're demonstrating that, maybe try to identify, speak about how you built it with something of a focus on the user experience instead of a step-by-step history. So we're not going to get a great sense of your project prototype if the screencast is then I did this, then I did this, then I did this, then I did this. More so if you're able to say, okay, well, the first section that the user is going to experience is this introduction section, and this is designed to gain their attention and to outline the objectives to them. And then the next section that the user will see, or the next thing that they have to do, is this section where I've tried to emphasize XYZ. So try to show the thing in action instead of just kind of, for example, the source file and a kind of a description of every step you took since the proposal, or since the proposal presentation. The breakdown between the screencast and the presentation is that the screencast is where you're giving us the evidence of the prototype, and the presentation is where you give us the details. So ideally the prototype, and I suppose remember that you will have both. You don't need to cram absolutely everything into the prototype screencast. Use the screencast to show us the prototype, the kind of end user experience in as much as is possible, and what that will be and what considerations you've put into that. The presentation then is where you would give us the details. So those details being, how it was built, why you made the design decisions that you did, factors which kind of impinged on your development or your decision-making process, or so on and so forth. So the screencast is really to show the thing in action and the user experience. The presentation, you will have the presentation then to give additional information on the decisions you made, the difficulties you encountered, so on and so forth. Once you have the prototype available, it's never too early to begin testing, and testing with yourself, but also ideally with end users. Again, I would say if you are going to be doing any informal testing, I would say one of the main things is to really try and kind of like with Sam, keep it rough and keep it kind of informal. It doesn't need to be a very detailed, structured testing process. That will come later when you're getting people to pilot it. Just giving it to someone that you trust, or someone in the area, or a peer, or even your fellow classmates, and just saying, would you just run through this for me and just see if you get stuck, if anything is unclear, if anything is like critically broken. And you want to avoid, maybe keep an eye out as well for what we refer to as quicksand points. So those are points in your prototype where the button to move on to the next section is not working, so the user is just stuck at that point. They can't progress, they can't move backwards. So that is an important element for, particularly for when you hand the final thing up to us, that there's none of those points, because if we can only get halfway through the thing and then we can't proceed to the end of it, obviously that creates major challenges for us in being able to give you marks, because we're only seeing half of your project. So I would encourage you to test, even at this stage, in a very informal way when you have your prototype ready, and maybe test with a view to just kind of catching any critical errors, any kind of major difficulties, but also obviously any kind of feedback users would have. One of the benefits of this kind of informal testing process is like you can get feedback, and we're not going to be looking for a full list of that feedback at this stage, so you can decide yourself whether you want to use it or not. One other element kind of following on from that is it's never really too early to start telling potential pilot participants about your need for them. You don't need to have every aspect of it worked out at this stage. You don't need to have a prototype that's ready to go. You don't need to have a very exact idea of what it is you're going to ask them. Just putting it in people's minds that, I will be testing this thing. It will be roughly this, for example, this week. I will just be asking you to do this. It will take no more than 30 minutes of your time. I'll send you an email with the link to it. Even that is probably getting too much into details, but making people aware of it now is important. I suppose it can, where students in previous years have encountered difficulties, definitely is they're letting pilot participants know like a week or a couple of days beforehand, and people are busy. Particularly this time of year, people are on holidays, people are unavailable, people get busy with work. So trying to book people in now, even kind of roughly, and kind of getting them to agree, giving them an idea of, it will be this week, it might be this date, it will be between this time and this time. That is a good step to do, because one of the biggest challenges very often is the logistics of just people being available to test what you've developed. So maybe get an idea of who'll be available during your intended piloting phase. Try and kind of book them in kind of an informal way, and start making plans around kind of any deficits or any problems. So kind of following on from that, try and think about your official testing carefully. Now, it's definitely no harm to let people know at this stage, and to try and maybe kind of informally book people in for a particular date or day or time or week even. When it comes to the official testing, then, as you're developing your prototype, it might be a good idea to think about how the official pilot participants, the official testing, how that might work, given what you've learned from developing your prototype to this phase. So, how are they going to access it? What hardware is going to be needed? Will they be using a desktop? Will they a desktop computer? Will they be using a tablet? Will they be using your phone? Even if you think about kind of the prototype you've developed, are you going to be able to make it available to them on these devices? Is there any additional software that they might have to install? Very often, if you're developing something for a smartphone or a tablet, you might find difficulties in being able to produce something for both Android and iOS. In which case, maybe consider, making your own device available to them. If you have it working on your machine, maybe that is the easiest way to get people to test it, by having them use your device, your laptop, your tablet or phone. But be aware, again, that does come with complications then, in that you need to be able to give them, to probably physically hand them your machine, your phone, your tablet, so on and so forth. So all of these kind of things are worth thinking about. How are they going to access it? How are you going to observe them? How are you going to get the data back from them? What will they need to have to be able to do the testing for you? And particularly kind of in these kind of times, consider the possibility that you're not going to be able to be in the same room as them. And given that, how are you going to overcome that? How are you going to address that? So thinking about these, you don't need to have like an absolutely perfect solution worked out at this stage, but do start thinking about and identifying these problems early on, and think about how you're going to solve them or manage them. And the final element then is just, and this is something we've mentioned before, make sure that the project can stand by itself. So it has to work in the context of a piece of real world tell. Now, for many of you, there is obviously going to be a clear link between the project and the thesis, in that kind of one, aspects of one will help inform the other and vice versa. But as we mentioned before, Shane, Brian and myself aren't going to be reading your thesis while we're looking at your project. So your project will have to stand by itself, independent of the thesis, and will have to work as a real world piece of TEL. So for that reason, it's important to make it as accessible and as engaging as possible. And why I mentioned that is that there were one or two previous years where a student kind of wanted to interrogate a particular research question, and to do that they made a kind of a deliberately bad project. And that might be very effective, or that approach might be useful for writing up their thesis, but we can't give marks to bad work for the project. So be aware, you want the project, kind of regardless of how it ties into the thesis or ties into anything else, you want it to be as good as possible. You want us to be able to look at it, to appreciate the kind of e-learning authoring and design work that has been done, and give you maximum marks for that. So it is important that it is that it's able to stand by itself. We won't be looking at your thesis. You won't be in the same room to explain the decisions you made or how to use it. So again, think about it like with your pilot. Think about your final hand up as, you're only going to be giving us a link to something, and we're going to have to be able to use it and go through it from there. So again, just make sure that the project that you hand up to us at the end, that it can stand by itself, that it is its own kind of work. So look, that's it. I think at this stage of the project, at this stage of the semester, looking forward to seeing your prototypes and the kind of work that has been done. And as always, if you have any questions, any concerns, or anything like that, do please feel free to get in touch with us. Again, Slack is probably the best place to do that. So look, the very best of luck, everyone, and hopefully talk to you all soon.